Hey guys, it's Belle, and in this video we're going to be reading through and translating this fascinating short little segment of Old Saxon prose, which is a fragment of a homily originally written by Bede in Latin, and we can see the fragment of Bede written down here below. So it's his 71st homily from the series of homilies that Bede created and which have survived, and this is a translation of that into the Old Saxon language, clearly for use in preaching to the laity. And we've got this little bit of it that survived, and it gives us some interesting insights into the use of the Old Saxon language in this time period. So, without further ado, I'll read through it from start to finish. We'll do our usual translation thing. And then at the end, we'll do a little bit of comparison with the Latin because there's some interesting ways that this changes as it goes into the vernacular. As we can see explicitly stated in the philosophies of Alfred Jovintium, which he confesses to in his prologues to his works and the prefaces to his works, I should say, when these people in the Middle Ages were translating things from Latin into the vernacular, they very much used it as an opportunity to change the text sometimes in ways that made the text conform more so to their notions of what was proper and authoritative. And if you want a really in-depth discussion on the ways in which this process can erase queer and LGBT figures from medieval history, or it did in the time period erase them from history, I would recommend the video I did called Lost in Translation, The Legend of Saint Eugenia. So without further ado, let's go on. I will read this from start to finish, and forgive me if my Old Saxon pronunciation is off, especially compared to the other languages that I do on this channel. I'm quite new at Old Saxon, so I beg your pardon. Wayleset Thor Sanctus Bonifatius Pavos an Roma was, that he bevi thenaciesur advocatum, that he imo an Romo en hus gevi, that thea liuri willon pantheon heton. One thar worthon alla avgona ina begangana, so he it imo tho Jejuvan hada, so wieda he it an usus drochtines erra en die userda fruan sancte Mariun en die allerdo Christus martyro, te thiu also thar ina begangan warth thiu menigi therra divlo, dat thar nu ina begangan wertha thiu jehugt allerdo godes heligono. He bot, though, that all that folk, this dagus, also the calent November anstendit, de cerricon quami, and the also that godly Cathianust, thar al ye don was, so whither ye warp manno ye willig, fra and the beliti to hus. And the thanana so warth ye wohoned, that mano hogido, achter allerdo therdo warli beget, thia ye hugt allerdo godes heligono. Ted thiu so what so we an themo gerda wergomeloson, that we it al hodigo ye fulon. And that we through the therdo heligono ye thingi becuman te themo ewigon liva, helphan themo usemo drochtine. So, what does all of this mean? We leseth, we read, Thor Sanctus Bonifatius Papos an Roma was, when the Pope Saint Boniface, or the Holy Pope Boniface, was in Rome, that he Bede thenaciesur advocatum, that he asked thenaciesur advocatum, the Emperor Advocatus, which we'll get to when we do the comparison, because it's quite fun, the fact that he's called that, that he imo an Romo en hus gevi, that he, so that the Emperor imo, to him, the him being Boniface, an Romo, in Rome, en hus gevi, would give him a house. Now, notice a couple of things here. First of all, this is literally exactly the same phrase, and if we go back, we can see it in the manuscript itself. So it's in this first line, an Roma was. So Pope Boniface the Pope was in Rome. And then down here, it says, again, he imo an Romo, and it's got this curious letter which I'm circling here, which is the O with a U above it. And this, along with the crossed D, we can see it again here, is unique in the Old Saxon orthography, and it means that this letter could be pronounced as either a U or an O. But clearly, it's also being written as an A as well, because there's no case distinction. They're both just dative singular cases here, un and then the dative case. So this must mean that the vowel at the end here could be pronounced as an a or an o or a u, or more plausibly, it was a vowel which was somewhere between all of these, or a vowel that was just not really emphasized very much. And for that reason, they were comfortable writing it more or less with anything, which is why I believe it's better to pronounce it as a schwa. So rather than anroma, maybe anroma. And same here, like instead of saying worthon, saying worthen, and just like schwa it away, you know? And once you do that, it actually sounds a good deal more like modern English, I would say. So, moving on. So the point is that when Pope Boniface was in Rome, he asked the Emperor Advocatum to give him a house. That thealudi huinon pantheon heton, that the people once called the Pantheon. One thar warthen alla afgoda ina begangana, when all unholy things took place within it. And these unholy things are, of course, referring to the worship of the pagan gods. So, hey it imo tho yeyivan hada. So he, and that's the emperor, it imo tho yeyivan hada. When he had commanded it, or when he had given it to him. So viera he it an uses drachtinas era. So he ruled it, viera he it, in honor of our Lord an uses drachtinas era. And the usero fruon Sancte Marion, and in the honor of Our Lady Saint Mary, and the Allera Christus Martyro, and all of the martyrs of Christ, te theo also, for which purposes also in such a manner, thar inna begangen warth, there where once many theoduvolo, so a multitude of devils had come to pass, that thar nu, so that now in that place, begangen wertha theo Jehugt, aller goddess heligono, the memory Jehugt of all of God's saints, aller goddess heligono, came to pass. So when this emperor gave the pantheon to Pope Boniface, he converted it into a house for God's honor and the honor of Mary and all of the martyrs, so that in the place where they once commemorated the devil, they now commemorate the holy saints. He bought thought that all that folk this dag is also the calend November anständigt to Kerkon Kwame. So this is a bit of a complicated sentence, but what it means is, he bought though is he commanded then that all that folk, that all the people, this dages on this day, also the calend November anständigt, when the first day, that's the calend of November, begins or is present, to Kerkon Kwame, that they should come to church. So this is Pope Boniface instituting the practice of Halloween, of All Saints' Day. And he also thought godlika theanost, and likewise that godly service thar aljadon was completely carried out there. So whether ye warth mano ye willik, so that each kind of man rather, departed from them fra endi blithi, free and happy, to whose he went back home. So Pope Boniface has instituted this practice that where people should come to the temple, or to the church at least, on the first day of November, but this means the last day of October, and they should celebrate the memory of all of the saints. And it was such a nice service that every man left there happy to go home. Very sweet. And the Thananos so war the Wanached, and then it was so inhabited, and it was so, I'm trying to think of the word for this. Yeah, it was inhabited in such a way that man hudige, so today, achter aller verder waraldi, after all of this world, beget thea jehugd aller godes heligono. He celebrates the memory of all of God's saints. So it's like the temple was inhabited in such a way that after a man had spent time in the world, he would commemorate the memory of God's holy saints. Te thiu so what so we an alemo thero yerda wergomeloson, to the extent that so what so whatever we an alemo thero yerda wergomeloson, whatever things we neglected during the year, that we it al hadigoye fulon, that we should fulfill all of it or make it all right on this one day. So this is almost saying that this is a day for reconciliation. This is a day for righting the wrongs that one has neglected during the year. This is Halloween. Hendi that we thurthero herigono yethingi bekoman, and that we should come through Yethingi, through the intercession of the holy men, Tethemo Evigon Liva, to the holy life. And then we have an interesting construction here, helpandemo usemodrachtne, with the Lord helping us. So that's what the fragment means. Now, I mentioned that it's a fragment because it is a fragment. This is part of the original Latin, and it goes on for a good deal longer because a sermon, it varies in length in the Middle Ages, but it takes roughly, like, I'd say between 10 minutes and half an hour to read a sermon aloud. And this is much shorter than that. This would be done in a minute or two. So we've clearly originally had more of this sermon, which has now unfortunately been lost, because the stuff that we have here tells us a lot of information about how the Old Saxon language sounded and how it functions. But there's a couple of curious little bits that I want to point out. Anybody fluent in both languages reading these two side by side will immediately appreciate that it's a bit of a loose translation. It's not super word for word here. Like, it says legimus in ecclesiasticis historis. We've read in ecclesiastical histories, whereas the Old Saxon shortens that down to we licet. And you can see that in the whole text, really. That extra information, which is in the Latin, is taken out of the Old Saxon, and this follows the sort of philosophy that Alfred of Evesham followed, where he thought that extra information which in the Latin text was unnecessary or would bore a quote-unquote unstudious reader wouldn't be necessary for somebody who's listening to a sermon that's been translated into the vernacular to hear. So rather than translating it, they cut it out for the sake of brevity. But what this does is it changes the way that these texts can function, right? Because there's exegetical value and historical value in many of these sermons, as would have been read. So when Bede read this sermon in Latin to presumably the monks at Monk Wearmouth Jarrow, all of this extra historical information would have been of benefit to the monks. They would have taken it in. So, for instance, the fact that Bonifacius, qui quartus beato Gregorio Romane urbis episcopatum tenebat, who was the fourth man from Blessed Gregory to hold the bishopric at Rome. That's a bit of information which is completely left out of the Old Saxon text. But it's a valuable bit of trivia to know that Pope Boniface was the fourth from Gregory. And the fact that it's left out means that the Old Saxon text can do fewer things in certain capacities than the original Latin text can. The original Latin text has a lot of things which can also function as a sort of educational thing. And we can see that in particular here, some of the reasons why they may have cut it out. So when they describe the Pantheon, for instance, the building quod ab antiquis Pantheon ante vocabatur, which was called the Pantheon by the ancients before. Now that bit is in there in the Old Saxon. It says, "Fat theo ludi huinon Pantheon heton." So that's in there. But then this next clause, "Quia hoc quasi simulacrum omnium videtur residiorum," because this building was seen to be almost a simulacrum or an imitation of all of the gods. That bit is left out. And perhaps part of the reason why it's left out is because, again, most Old Saxon texts are written in a time period in the first generation or the second generation after Christianization. So heathenism is still potting around and it's still quite a serious threat. If you watch my video on the Old Saxon confessional text, you can see how they mention heathenism in the text. One of the sins that it imagines a person may have committed is the sin of having listened to heathen religious songs and ceremonies, etc. So perhaps they did not translate this explanation of what the Pantheon functioned as because they don't want to give any sort of validation to or even memory of the fact that there was an old pagan religion. It's just like all the memory they want them to have is that this was the place where the devils were. This was a place where there was many terrorivolo. There was a multitude of devils, but they don't want to talk about what these devils were. They certainly don't want to call them gods. That's a key difference. We have them being referred to as devils here, and there are demons here as well, but the pantheon itself is referred to as a multitude of gods. And this is true, according to the Romans obviously didn't think of their own deities as demons, but what I'm doing by pointing this out is showing you how the Old Saxon text cleanses in some ways and depaganizes even more so than its original text, because of course this is a Christian homily, but the Old Saxon text removes pagan information from the original and therefore makes it safer to preach to an audience which might contain some people who are still unsure whether they favor Christianity or Germanic heathenry. And one last point to end on with this is a very fun little mess up that the translator did, and I think they got away with it simply because nobody's going to know any better. So the emperor in this case, the Latin says, "Suis precibus a foca Cesare impetrare donari, ecclesiae Christi templum Romae." So, Pope Boniface asked the temple at Rome to be given to the Church of Christ, suis precibus, by his prayers, a foca Cesare. So by the emperor focus, or by this Caesar focus, or foca, and this person has translated that not as focus, but as advocatum, which is the Latin word for lawyer, which I find very amusing and very funny. They did get Chiesa largely right, to their credit, I suppose. So we have Caesar focus becoming Caesar the lawyer in this text, but it's not as if the laity that was listening to this text being read loud in Old Saxon would know that the word advocatum means lawyer in Latin, so they probably didn't mind the mistake. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you want me to teach you Old Saxon or any of the other languages that I do on this channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon, which will be linked in the description of this video. You can also join my Discord server, where I often post these little mock-ups and glosses that I do of medieval texts before I turn them into videos, so you can get early access there. And until next time, thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a nice day. Bye everyone!